Le Mans, France. February 2nd, 1933. The rain fell like knives. Narrow cobblestone streets shone with the sheen of water, reflecting the weak orange glow of gas lamps. Behind shuttered windows, families huddled against the cold, unaware that just a few streets away, horror was about to carve itself into history. Inside one home on Rue Brier, silence hung heavy, too heavy. For behind those walls lay a scene of carnage so grotesque, even hardened policemen would struggle to describe it. A mother and daughter, slain not by strangers, not by thieves or soldiers, but by the very women who had served them for years. The killers were sisters, servants, shadows who had waited, watched, and then erupted. Tonight we walk with them, into their lives, into their silence, into the storm that was building long before that night of blood. France in the early 1930s was a nation split in two. On the surface, modernity. Paris was alive with jazz clubs, smoky cabarets, and cafes where intellectuals argued into the night. Cinema flickered across whitewashed walls. Radios crackled with voices. The world was rushing forward. But outside Paris, time slowed. In towns like Le Mans, traditions suffocated the air. The church loomed large, morality was rigid, and class divisions were carved into stone. If you were born into wealth, you lived with servants polishing your shoes, ironing your linen, keeping your household in silent motion. If you were born poor, you became that silent motion. Domestic service was not just work. It was an entire existence. Servants rose before dawn, lit the stoves, scrubbed and polished, and often lived in the very houses where they worked, yet were never truly part of them. They existed in a strange twilight, present but unseen, needed but unwanted. For women like Christine and Leah Papin, daughters of poverty, there were few choices. They would become nuns or maids. Both paths demanded silence, obedience, and the erasure of the self. Imagine this, your entire life measured not by your desires, but by the shine of silverware, your worth reduced to the absence of dust. For many young women in France, this was not choice, it was destiny, and the Papin sisters were no exception. The Papins were born already wounded. Their father, Gustave, drank heavily and drifted from job to job. Their mother, Clemence, was known for her coldness. Some neighbors whispered that she seemed to despise motherhood itself, as if the very presence of her daughters was a burden. There are three Papin sisters: Emilia, the eldest, born in 1902, Christine in 1905, and Leah in 1911. Emilia's story is its own tragedy. As a child, she was placed in the care of relatives, then later entered convent. There, whispers of abuse emerged, a priest allegedly forcing himself on her. The family hushed it up. Emilia eventually became a nun, disappearing from the household and the narrative, but leaving a legacy of unspoken pain. Christine and Leah remained behind, but not with stability. Clemence routinely farmed out her daughters, sending them to live with relatives or institutions. As though they were burdens she could shed at will. The sisters grew up knowing one thing: they were not wanted. Christine was strong-willed, dark-haired, and sharp-eyed. She had a fiery spirit, but no outlet. At 15, she was placed into domestic service. She quickly became known as competent, diligent, but difficult, intolerant of authority, prone to flashes of stubborn defiance. Leah was her opposite, shy, submissive, a pale, quiet girl with downcast eyes. She moved like a shadow, almost invisible. Employers often forgot she was in the room, but together they were inseparable. In a world that discarded them, they clung to one another with a desperation that bordered on obsession. This is crucial. Where society abandoned them, they became each other's everything. To Christine, Leah was not just a sister. She was her confidant, her companion, her possession. And to Leah, Christine was both protector and master. What they lacked from their parents, they found in one another. But such bonds, when forged in trauma, can be dangerous. They can twist into something consuming, something unbreakable. By the late 1920s, Christine and Leah found employment together, something rare and precious for sisters. They entered the household of René Lancelin, a retired lawyer, his wife Leonie, and their adult daughter Genevieve. The Lancelins were comfortably bourgeois. Their home on Rue Bruyere was respectable, not grand. Stone walls, shuttered windows, rooms filled with polished furniture, oil lamps, and crucifixes. The Papins lived upstairs in a cramped attic room with slanted ceilings, barely large enough for 2 narrow beds. The window overlooked the gray rooftops of Le Mans. Their days were relentless. Wake before dawn, fetch water, light the stove, prepare coffee, scrub, polish, dust, launder. They worked in silence, their presence barely acknowledged. If they did their jobs perfectly, they might receive indifference. If they faltered, they would hear Madame's sharp tongue. Madame Leonie was not cruel by the standards of her class. She was simply exacting. Her standards were impossibly high, her patience short. A crooked seam, an undercooked meal, a speck of dust. All were offenses. She treated her servants as tools, not people. And Christine, fiery and proud, absorbed each insult like acid burning into her skin. Yet outwardly they endured. For nearly 7 years, the Papin sisters served without scandal. To neighbors, they seemed quiet, efficient, reliable. But behind the silence, storms were brewing. It is here in the monotony of daily life that madness takes root. Christine, the stronger of the two, grew increasingly tense. She resented Madame's scoldings, resented the servitude itself. But she swallowed her rage. Day after day, insult after insult, she said nothing. She poured all her frustrations inward, where they fermented. Leah mirrored Christine in everything. If Christine folded sheets a certain way, Leah followed. If Christine scowled at Madame behind her back, Leah did too. Christine became not just her sister, but her world. Without Christine's direction, Leah seemed incapable of independent thought. Their employers noticed their odd closeness. The sisters were never apart. On Sundays, their single day off, they spent every moment together. They spoke little to others, even their own family. When Amelia, their elder sister, tried to visit, Christine refused. She wanted no intrusion. The 2 Papins against the world, that was all. Notice how isolation functions here. The sisters cut off family, cut off friends, cut off anyone who might break their bond. What remained was a closed circuit of dependency, where anger, fear, and obsession fed only on themselves. In such a circuit, pressure builds until something must give. The day was Thursday, February 2nd, 1933. It began like any other. The weather was foul. Heavy rain drumming on the roof, rattling against shutters. Madame and Genevieve went into town that afternoon, leaving the sisters to their chores. Accounts vary, but one detail recurs. A fuse had blown, leaving part of the house in darkness. Christine attempted to fix it, but when the Lancelin women returned and discovered the problem, Madame reportedly scolded her sharply. That small spark, a scolding over an electrical fault, lit the fuse. Christine, already simmering with resentment, snapped. She lunged at Genevieve, grabbing her by the throat. In shock, Genevieve fought back, but Christine screamed for Leah's help. Obedient, submissive Leah joined in. What followed was not a fight. It was an explosion. They beat the women, clawed at their faces, gouged out their eyes with bare hands. In the frenzy, they fetched a hammer and a kitchen knife. They slashed, bludgeoned, mutilated. The attack lasted nearly 30 minutes, long enough for rage to burn through exhaustion, long enough for control to vanish. When it was over, Madame and her daughter lay in a pool of blood, their faces destroyed, eyes torn out. Their bodies were unrecognizable. And the sisters? They washed, climbed the stairs, and lay together in their attic bed, calm, almost serene, awaiting discovery. That evening, when Monsieur Lancelin returned home, he was surprised to find the house dark. The door was locked. No answer came. With growing dread, he summoned the police. When they forced the door, what they found was a scene from nightmare. Blood spattered the walls, pooled on the floor. 2 women, mutilated beyond recognition. And upstairs, the sisters, silent, composed, waiting. The silence was over. The rage had spoken. But now came the questions. What had driven them to such horror? Madness? Hatred? Or something darker? Something born of silence itself? The trial that followed would not simply be about murder. It would become a battleground for ideas, about class, psychology, even the very nature of humanity. and the Papin sisters, once invisible shadows, would become the most infamous servants in France. The house was silent, too silent. Monsieur Lancelin stood outside in the rain, peering through the shutters, his key turning uselessly in the lock. It was late. His wife and daughter should have been home, lamps lit, supper waiting. But the windows stared back, black and cold. Something was wrong, something unspeakable. He summoned the police. Together, they forced the door. The stench of iron hit first, blood thick in the air. Then the sight of a massacre. His wife Leonie and daughter Genevieve, beaten beyond recognition, their eyes torn from their skulls. On the landing above, silence again. And in the attic, two sisters lying calmly in bed. They had not fled. They had not hidden. They were waiting. The policemen's lanterns cut across the sisters' pale faces. Christine's eyes were wide, but unflinching. Leah's gaze dropped immediately, submissive, like a child awaiting punishment. They were arrested without resistance. The gendarmes marched the sisters out into the rain-soaked street. Curious neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispers darting through the night. What has happened? Why are the servants in chains? Christine tried to speak, not with denial, not with excuses, but with one strange demand. She insisted that she and Leah be kept together, always together. When an officer attempted to separate them, Christine erupted in hysteria, clawing at him, screaming, "You cannot take her from me." Leah, passive as ever, merely cried and clung to her sister's arm. Even in the face of unimaginable violence, their obsession with one another remained. For Christine, Leah was not just family, she was the air she breathed. And the thought of separation was more terrifying than the gallows. At the police station, the sisters were questioned separately. Christine resisted violently at first, demanding her sister. Eventually, the officers relented, placing them in the same cell. Only then did Christine calm. When asked about the murders, Christine spoke in chilling detail, but without remorse. She described how a sudden rage had overtaken her, how she attacked Genevieve first, how Leah obeyed her command to finish the job. The officers sat in stunned silence as she calmly recounted the gouging of eyes, the blows with hammer and knife. It was clinical, almost detached. Leah, question alone, broke quickly. She admitted everything, but her version was simple. Christine told me to. I did what she said. This became the pattern. Christine dominated, spoke, decided. Leah followed. Prison life was unlike servitude. There was no silverware to polish, no floors to scrub. But for the Papin sisters, one thing mattered more. Were they together? At first, yes. The jailers kept them in adjoining cells, able to whisper through the bars. Christine grew calmer. She even hummed lullabies to her sister, as though mothering her. But when the authorities decided to separate them entirely, Christine unraveled. She screamed, sobbed, tore at her clothes. Once she had to be restrained as she tried to gouge out her own eyes, a grotesque mirror of what she had done to her victims. Notice the symmetry. They had torn out the eyes of their mistresses. Now Christine sought to blind herself. Was it guilt, or the collapse of her identity without her sister's gaze to anchor her? The prison doctors began to whisper. Was Christine insane? Was this not murder, but madness? October 1933. The courthouse in Le Mans swelled with journalists, intellectuals, curious citizens. Everyone wanted to glimpse the sisters who had committed the crime of the century. They entered the dock together, small, pale, wearing simple black dresses. They looked nothing like monsters. Christine's dark eyes darted about the courtroom with defiance. Leah's gaze remained fixed on the floor, as though she wished to vanish. The charges were read: double homicide, premeditated brutality, mutilation. The crowd shivered. The prosecution painted them as dangerous degenerates, filled with hatred for their employers, striking without provocation. The defense countered, this was not malice, but psychosis. They were overworked, humiliated, driven mad by servitude and isolation. Witnesses testified. Neighbors spoke of the sisters' diligence, their quiet obedience. Employers praised their work ethic, but none could explain the sudden eruption of violence. Outside the courtroom, the Papin case became more than a crime. It became a symbol. The Surrealists, led by Jean Genet and Paul Éluard, hailed the sisters as heroines of rebellion, oppressed servants who struck back at bourgeois cruelty. They wrote essays declaring the murders a revolutionary act, a protest against a class system built on silence and humiliation. Psychiatrists saw it differently. They diagnosed Christine with shared paranoid disorder, folie à deux, a rare condition where delusions are transmitted between close individuals. In this reading, Christine's paranoia infected Leah, who lacked the will to resist. Two interpretations emerged. Were they oppressed victims striking back? Or were they mad women lost in each other's shadows? France could not decide. And perhaps that was the true horror, that these two fragile women were both at once. The jury deliberated. The verdict was inevitable. Christine was sentenced to death by guillotine. The crowd gasped, but the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment due to her deteriorating mental state. Leah, the follower, was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. In the dock, Christine broke down, screaming for her sister. Leah, she had to be dragged away, thrashing like a child ripped from her mother's arms. Leah wept silently, unable to raise her head. Imprisonment was slow death. Christine's mental state collapsed. She refused to eat. She clawed at herself. She begged guards to bring her sister, insisting they were one soul in two bodies. Eventually, she refused all food, as if starving herself might reunite her with Leah in death. She wasted away thin as bone and died in 1937, just 4 years after the murders. Leah served 8 years, released early for good behavior. She returned to live with her mother in a small town, working quietly as a maid under an assumed name. She lived into her 70s, fading into obscurity. Some reports claim she was blind in her final years, a grim echo of the crime that had defined her life. So what are we to make of Christine and Leah Papin? Two poor girls, discarded by family, devoured by servitude, who turned one night into furies, gouging out the eyes of those who commanded them. Were they monsters? Victims? Symbols of revolt? Or merely two fragile minds collapsing into madness? Their crime lingers because it resists meaning. It was too brutal to ignore, too senseless to explain, too symbolic to dismiss. In the end, the Papin sisters remind us of something terrible. When silence is enforced too long, when humiliation is swallowed too deep, the eruption will come. And when it comes, it blinds. The trial ended. The verdicts were delivered. Christine, condemned to life in prison, spiraled into madness and death. Leah, sentenced to 10 years, eventually faded into obscurity. But the story of the Papin sisters did not end there. No, in many ways it had just begun. For what happened in that bourgeois home in Le Mans was not merely a crime. It was a rupture, one that spilled into philosophy, literature, psychology, and art. The Papin sisters became more than murderers. They became symbols, questions, specters that haunted the very foundations of French thought in the 20th century. The newspapers feasted on the case. In 1933, every headline screamed the same horror. Servants slaughter mistresses. The brutality of the killings, gouged eyes, mutilated bodies, shocked the public. The middle class shuddered. For servants, the very backbone of bourgeois households could erupt in such savagery. What did that mean for the safety of families who relied on them? Yet beneath the fear was fascination. The public devoured every detail of the trial, every photograph of the pale, meek-looking sisters. How could such small, quiet women commit such monstrous acts? Notice the hypocrisy. The bourgeoisie, who had treated servants as invisible, suddenly could not look away. The Papins had forced themselves into visibility, but only through horror. The silence of servitude had ended in a scream. While the public gasped, the artists exulted. The surrealists André Breton, Paul Éluard, Salvador Dali saw in the Papin sisters not murderers, but rebels. To them, the crime was a poetic explosion, a rejection of bourgeois order. The eyes torn from the mistresses were, in surrealist interpretation, a metaphor. The destruction of the gaze of authority, the refusal to be watched, judged, diminished. Paul Éluard wrote that the Papins had restored to us the sense of the marvelous. Jean Genet later praised them as figures of purity, who through blood had freed themselves. This was not sympathy. It was appropriation. The Surrealists did not care about Christine and Leah as women, as humans. They cared about what the sisters represented: chaos against order, desire against repression, revolt against hierarchy. To the Surrealists, the Papin Sisters were heroines of liberation. But liberation at what cost? The cost was 2 bodies on a floor, torn and eyeless. The cost was madness, prison, death. Symbols are easy to worship. Flesh and blood are harder to forgive. In 1933, a young psychiatrist named Jacques Lacan, later one of the most influential psychoanalysts of the century, published an essay on the Papin case. He diagnosed them with folie à deux, madness shared by 2. Christine, the dominant personality, imposed her delusions upon Leah, who absorbed them completely. Together, they spiraled into psychosis, feeding each other's paranoia until violence became inevitable. For Lacan, the Papins embodied the terrifying power of intimacy unbound. 2 selves collapsing into one, boundaries dissolved, reality warped. We like to believe madness is an individual affliction, that it strikes the lonely mind, isolated. But what if madness can be contagious? What if intimacy itself can be a disease? Christine and Leah Papin suggest exactly that. That love, when absolute, can devour reason. The case also fascinated Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, the existentialist philosophers. For Sartre, the Papins symbolized the condition of human freedom under oppression. Servants, stripped of identity, reduced to function, had no outlet for freedom but destruction. Their crime was not only violence against 2 women, but against an entire social structure that denied them existence. De Beauvoir later reflected on the case in feminist terms. The sisters' rage was not only class revolt, but gendered revolt. Women reduced to obedience, denied education, denied independence, finally struck back at their female oppressors. Women who, though also constrained by patriarchy, wielded power cruelly over other women. It is telling that so many intellectuals saw themselves in the sisters. They projected philosophies, revolutions, manifestos onto 2 women who in truth may have only wanted silence, recognition, love. The world made them symbols, but symbols rarely tell the whole truth. The Papin sisters inspired plays, films, novels. In 1947, Jean Genet's play The Maids reimagined their story. 2 servants who in ritual role-play plot the murder of their mistress. On stage, their bond became theatrical, erotic, destructive. Later, directors like Louis Buñuel and Claude Chabrol adapted variations of the story into film. Writers and artists returned again and again to the crime, unable to let it rest. Why? Because the Papin case seemed to touch something primal. Servitude, humiliation, obsession, eruption. It was not merely a murder story. It was a mirror of power, love, and violence that could apply anywhere, in families and nations, in the human heart. While Christine died in prison in 1937, Leah lived on. After her release in 1941, she returned to live with her mother. She worked quietly as a maid under an assumed name, fading into anonymity. Reports are scarce, rumors plentiful. Some say she remained timid, withdrawn, never forming close ties. Some claim she went blind in her final years, a haunting echo of the eyes she had once helped destroy. She died in 1982 at the age of 71. No headlines, no cameras, just silence. Think of it. For nearly 50 years after the crime, Leah lived as a ghost. The world debated her meaning, her symbol, her madness. But she herself remained mute. We do not know what she thought, what she felt, what she carried. Perhaps she did not know either. Perhaps silence consumed her, as it always had. Why does the story of the Papin sisters endure? Because it unsettles. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that ordinary people crushed by silence can erupt into extraordinary violence, that intimacy, when absolute, can consume identity and reason, that class divides are not only economic but psychological prisons, that women doubly oppressed can turn their fury not against men, but against other women. revealing how power circulates in cruel hierarchies. And perhaps most of all, the Papin case endures because it resists final meaning. Were they mad? Were they rebels? Were they simply broken human beings? The Papin sisters are gone. Their story lingers. In every debate about madness, oppression, rebellion, their shadows flicker. They remind us of a truth too terrible to dismiss, that beneath obedience may lie rage, and beneath rage the abyss. One might imagine the story ends when the cell door slams shut that justice, in its merciless simplicity, closes the book on horror. But with the Papin sisters, that was never true. Their lives did not simply fade into silence. They rotted, they unraveled. They bled into the very soul of French society. And in that unraveling, something more sinister emerged. A question too dangerous to be left unanswered. Were Christine and Leah mere killers, or the embodiment of a world so cruel it could drive two women into madness? The prison at Rennes was built like a fortress of stone and iron, a labyrinth where echoes carried like restless ghosts. It was here, in the bitter winter of 1933, that Christine Papin began her descent into an abyss no punishment could equal. Her death sentence had been commuted to life at hard labor, a reprieve that looked merciful on paper, but felt like a living grave. The walls pressed in. The silence was maddening, and above all else, there was one torment she could not endure: separation from Leah. Christine begged the wardens day after day for contact with her younger sister. Her voice, once quiet and reserved, now trembled with desperation. At first, they denied her. Prison protocol was merciless, but Christine did not relent. Her pleas turned into screams, her screams into hysteria. Prison doctors recorded strange behaviors. She refused food. She clawed at her skin. At night, guards would hear her muttering through the iron door, "I am Leah. Leah is me. They cannot divide us." The psychological bond between the sisters, so fierce it had once seemed supernatural, now became a curse. Within months, Christine collapsed. Thin, pale, and glass-eyed, she stopped recognizing reality. At times, she tore at her own body as if to punish herself. At others, she struck her head against the wall, crying that voices whispered in her ear. Doctors labeled her condition psychosis with paranoid delusions. But notice here the eerie paradox. She had been perfectly lucid in court, calm, articulate, intelligent. Only in isolation did her mind begin to rock. It was as if the Papin sisters were never meant to exist apart. By 1937, Christine was transferred to a psychiatric hospital. She lasted there only a few years. In May of 1937, she refused all food, slowly starving herself until death arrived. She was just 32 years old. Imagine the horror of it. A woman who once slit open her employer's face with a kitchen knife, reduced to a fragile shadow, choosing death by hunger rather than life without her sister. While Christine disintegrated in prison, Leah's fate was altogether different. Her sentence, initially 10 years of hard labor, had been reduced to 8 for good behavior. She emerged from prison in 1941 into a France transformed by Nazi occupation. But freedom, for Leah, was no liberation. She was branded for life. Wherever she went, whispers followed. That's the sister, the murderess. She found work under false names, mostly in lowly domestic positions, bitterly ironic, for it was servitude that had birthed her nightmare in the first place. Some accounts claim she reunited with her mother. Others say she tried to live quietly in anonymity. In 1965, decades after the crime, a journalist tracked her down in Nantes. By then, Leah was an old woman, worn and frail, her body twisted by illness. She agreed to no interviews, no explanations. She died in 2001, at the age of 89, a silent ghost, long outliving her sister but never escaping her shadow. If the sisters vanished into obscurity, their crime most certainly did not. France in the 1930s was a cauldron of intellectual and political upheaval, and the murder at Le Mans became a symbol. Twisted, controversial, unforgettable. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre saw in them a metaphor for alienation and class struggle. Simone de Beauvoir hinted at the unbearable pressures of patriarchy and servitude. The surrealists, led by Jean Genet and Jacques Lacan, call the crime a revolutionary act of liberation, an explosion against bourgeois oppression. To them, the Papin sisters were not merely killers. They were martyrs of class war, slaves who rebelled against their masters with the only weapons they had: knives, hammers, their own bare hands. Notice how differently society interpreted the blood-soaked crime scene. To the family of Lancelin, it was barbarism. To intellectuals, it was poetry. One saw savagery. The other saw revolution. But beneath the ideological debates lurked a darker fascination. Artists painted the sisters as demonic twins, eyes wide with madness. Playwrights reimagined their lives as Gothic tragedies. Films twisted their story into horror allegories. They became legends, less human beings than archetypes of repressed rage. Nearly a century has passed, yet the story of the Papin sisters continues to unsettle. It asks questions that cannot be buried. How much cruelty can a human endure before they snap? Were Christine and Leah monsters, or victims sculpted by poverty, abuse, and servitude? And perhaps most chilling of all, could it happen again anywhere under the right conditions? Modern psychologists argue the sisters exhibited signs of folie à deux, a shared psychosis, where one dominant personality, Christine, imposed her delusions onto the other, Leah. But even clinical terms cannot fully explain the brutality, nor the eerie bond that united them beyond reason. In French collective memory, their faces linger like phantoms. Two maids in black uniforms, one taller, one smaller, hands clasped in silence, eyes burning with some terrible secret. The house at 6 Rue Bruyère in Le Mans has long since been remodeled. Families have come and gone. Children play in its courtyard. Yet the walls remember. And every so often, whispers return of the day when blood flooded the staircase and the bourgeois home became a slaughterhouse. The Papin sisters remind us that horror does not always wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes it comes dressed in uniform, with lowered eyes, carrying a tray to the table. Their story is not merely a tale of murder, but of a bond so fierce it destroyed itself, and a society so blind it never saw the fury growing in its servants' silence. In the end, the Papin sisters became more than killers. They became a question, one that still trembles in the dark corners of history.